Earlier in the series, we saw how to flatten part of a landscape using a texture object mask. Now we're going to look at another, more flexible way of non-destructively art directing a procedural terrain. And this technique has relevance anytime you want to make customized, reversible changes to a model. It takes us to places we could never go with parametric deformers such as push or taper, and this technique gives us more control than we could achieve with freeform deformers or FFDs. In this example, I'd like once again to flatten out the terrain near the camera. I could do this with soft selection, but that would normally be a destructive workflow. Let me just show you what the issue is with soft selection with a standard destructive workflow. I'm going to select this terrain object and right-click and convert to editable poly. Once that's converted, we can go into vertex sub-object mode, and we want to select the region near the camera. Let's use a circular selection region. And in the top view, select near the camera if you can see it. And we can check that in the perspective view, orbit around. So I've made that selection. And I can enable soft selection. Go ahead and turn on use soft selection and set the fall off amount to 50 meters. And now we can use the move tool to transform these selected sub-objects and the soft selected sub-objects. But once again, doing it this way is destructive and non-reversible. If I move these points down and then release the mouse, click again and move them back up again, we are not able to get them back to where they were and preserve the original shape. And we've additionally got some issues here. So I'm going to undo those two movements with Control Z and show you also that if you want to try to scale, you'll have a similar issue. I'll choose the Scale tool and scale only in the Z axis to flatten that out. And eventually it will be perfectly flat once we have a scale of 0 there. And if I decide I want to scale those back up again, I won't be able to because I've destructively removed all of that scale information. It's always going to be more or less flat there in the center. Okay, so we want a non-destructive workflow. I'm going to undo all of these changes. Right-click on the Undo button and go all the way back to Convert to Editable Poly and click Undo. Okay, so we want this non-destructive workflow so that we can make reversible custom adjustments to the model. And also for this terrain object, we can keep it as a plane primitive so that we can increase the polygon density at render time and get a very nice level of detail on the rendering. The tool we're going to use for this non-destructive modeling operation is a modifier called Linked Xform. And what it does is allow you to link a selection of sub-objects to an external control object. And as you transform that control object, you're able to reversibly move the sub-objects around. And it works in soft selection mode as well, which is very, very important in this case. We can use any object to drive the transforms of the sub-object selection, but it makes sense to use something that won't render like a point helper. Go to the Create panel and choose Helpers. Click Point, and in the top viewport, click somewhere near the camera, and then right-click to exit Creation. With that point helper still selected, go to the Modify panel and set its size to 30 meters. Let's just zero out its position. Choose the Move tool. Set its X position to 0 and its Y position to negative 415 meters. And the Z position will leave at 0. Now we can make a sub-object selection, and the best way to do that in this case is with a volume select modifier, because that is also non-destructive, and it's not dependent upon the resolution of the underlying geometry. Go back to selecting the terrain object and add a modifier at the top of the stack. Choose Modifier List and Volume Select. Set the stack selection level to Vertex and the select by type to volume sphere. And if you look in the side view, you can see that we've got a gizmo or a sphere that's really stretched. So let's unstretch that. Go up into the volume select modifier and open it up. Select the gizmo subobject mode and choose the scale tool and scale that vertically in that side viewport. And then click in the center of the scale gizmo and scale the entire sphere down. And you can see that any vertex that's inside that volume is going to be selected and passed up the stack. We want to snap this gizmo to the position of our existing point helper. So let's do that. Orbit around and make sure that you can actually see that point helper really clearly. Then go into the Grid and Snap Settings dialog. Right-click on any one of the magnet icons and set the snaps to pivot only. And then close the dialog and enable 3D snaps. Grab the Move tool and then select in the center to choose that Move gizmo and then drag over until you snap to the helper object. Release the mouse and then we can turn off 3D snaps. And we're still in gizmo sub-object mode here, so let's scale it down a little bit more. Figure out what vertices we want to hard select. And then enable Use Soft Selection and increase the fall off. It's going to need to be quite a high value in this case. Let's try a fall off of 2000. So we've got our selection made, and the selection gizmo is snapped to that helper object. And all that remains is to link the helper object to this selection. Back up in the terrain modifier list, add a Linked Xform modifier. Then click on the Pick Control Object button and click on the helper object in a viewport. And now that connection has been made, and we can select the helper object and use the Move tool. Position it in Z, move it up and down. And you can do that repeatedly, and you will see that it's a non-destructive operation. And if I want to restore that shape back to its original shape, just need to move this helper object back down to its original position, which is a Z position of 0. So I can just type in 0 down here. And now I've just reversed the operation. We can do all sorts of crazy things to this. We can move that around and maybe rotate it and scale it and do all sorts of interesting things. And it's all reversible. I can go back to the Select and Uniform Scale tool, right-click on that icon, and set the local X, Y, and Z values to 100. Just press Tab and type in 100. Same with Rotate. I can right-click on Rotate, restore its values to 0, and position, just the Z position needs to go back to 0. And again, I've reversed all of those modeling changes. So what we really want to do here is just to flatten out the terrain. I'll go back to the Select and Uniform Scale tool. We can click and drag in the vertical axis in any viewport, or we can enter a value in numerically in the Scale Transform Type In dialog. Let's give it a value of 20%. We can continue this process if we want. We can go back to the terrain object and stack more volume selections and more linked Xforms. Select different parts of the terrain and manipulate them separately. Here's a finished render of the shot, and that's how to use Linked Xform as a non-destructive modeling tool.